Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the globe today. My name is Jonathan Wolfe, Joe Wolfe, from the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, co-organizer of the conference with Shelley Tremaine, who has put the incredible program together for us. I'm a white man, graying hair, glasses, wearing a black cardigan, grey t-shirts. I will hand over to Mitch Curia in a moment to introduce our first speaker, Tommy Curry. But I just want to mention a few things, sort of housekeeping and how the sessions work. So first of all, we have automatic live transcript, live captioning. If you want to use that, the instructions are in the chat, but the basic idea is if you click on the CC button at the bottom for live transcript, you'll be given a number of options, of which show subtitle is the main one. And if you don't like the size of the subtitles, you can adjust that through the settings. When we come to the Q&A session, could you please put any questions you have in the Q&A? You can do that even during the talk. The questions will be moderated by us and we'll pass them onto the chair. But to help the moderator, it's possible to upvote a question. So if there's a question you particularly like the look of, would like to have it answered, you can give it a thumbs up and it will go up higher in the queue. One last thing before I hand over. I understand that as participants, you can see the number of people, but not who they are. And so if you would like to introduce yourself, make yourself known to others, do please feel free to put just a short message saying who you are and perhaps a little bit about you, not too much, into the chat. Okay, so without further ado, I'll pass over to you, Mitch, for the first session.
Thank you. I'll describe myself. I'm a white genderqueer woman with short black hair and a black shirt. So hello, everyone. As a longtime fan of Tommy Curry's work, I'm very pleased and honored to be chairing his session today. Dr. Curry is a professor of philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, where he holds a personal chair in Africana philosophy and Black male studies. His many accolades include winning the American Book Award for The Man Not and being named one of the leading emerging scholars in the US by Diverse Magazine. The reason I was personally drawn to his work is that one of my main research interests is the politics of responsibility, and Professor Curry has written extensively about how Black males are stereotyped as perpetrators of violence, sexual predation, and child abuse, while their own susceptibility to these forms of violence is dismissed and underreported. This creates a bias in the responsibility system because it allows Black males to be scapegoated as violent criminals, while the perpetrators of violence against Black males are too often allowed to evade blame and accountability. Professor Curry has also written about how the vilification of Black masculinity tends to prevent Black males from being recognized as disabled, which further contributes to the scapegoating of this group as quote unquote invincible super predators who are invulnerable to abuse. I'm pleased to announce that Professor Curry will be contributing to a special issue of Feminist Philosophy Quarterly on responsibility that I will be editing next year, in which he will no doubt shed more light on these injustices, which have been widely ignored and dismissed in feminist theory. I cannot overstate the importance of Professor Curry's research, not just to my field, but to virtually every area of philosophy. And with that said, I'll give him the floor and let him introduce his latest work.
Thank you so much, Mitch. Let me begin by saying that, well, first let me describe myself, I'm sorry. I'm a Black man with increasing evidence of growing hair and age in a blue sweater. This project is entitled Pruriently Feared, theorizing the imposition of another's will upon the disabled Black male body as a form of sexual vulnerability. And I want to say a little bit about the direction that my work in Black male studies has taken. Philosophers often elide evidence, and we do so to our detriment. because the intellectual and moral cases that we largely argue for presume that there are states in the world that comport to what we think our normative values are. We wish to consider people who are being overlooked, abused, and who suffer. But often the ways that we come about understanding who's disadvantaged, abused, and suffer doesn't come from the people that we don't see or the people that we despise. In fact, it comes from the people that we want to recognize and people that we see as being part of our own group. My work attends to groups of people that have historically been despised across the world, victims of dehumanization and victims of monstrosity. And what I'm trying to do today in this particular paper is highlight a case that I commented on, uh, that of Mr. Ernest Johnson, and how intellectual disability among Black men refuses to be considered not only by legal philosophers and ethicists, but by courts and the public at large. So I begin by saying that the pain and suffering of disabled Black men have remained a relatively ignored subject in disability studies. If you do Google searches, you'll come up with less than 10 articles specifically looking at the experiences disabled Black men suffer. But Black males are the group that are most likely to be criminalized, ostracized, and stigmatized for disabilities. And despite this empirical fact, rarely do they make an appearance in theories of the body beyond the common assertion that Black male bodies inspire fear. So this paper will examine the philosophical implications of Mr. Ernest Johnson's execution by the state of Missouri and tie this to forms of Black male vulnerability. I'm arguing that the societal phobias concerning Black males are often disconnected from their ability to be imposed upon and defined by the will of others. Black men are often thought to be whatever others perceive of them. In my book, I describe this as a characterological defect, and I argue that it endures not only through stereotypes, but the ability of whites and women to define the disabled Black male for others, largely as threats. So this paper argues that disabled Black maleness is a positionality that must be considered vulnerable to sexual and lethal violence, particularly from others. So let me introduce you to Mr. Ernest Johnson. On October 5th, 2021, Mr. Ernest Johnson was murdered by the state of Missouri by lethal injection. Now, Mr. Johnson was a 61-year-old Black man suffering from mental disabilities and a lifetime of trauma, violent abuse, and neglect. He did commit murder in 1994 and has never denied the fact that he was woefully sorry for this crime. But constitutionally, the question arose because Mr. Johnson was mentally disabled and had a life of academic underachievement, adaptive gaps, and societal disadvantage. As a young boy, Mr. Johnson was a victim of various forms of abuse and neglect. Reviews of Mr. Johnson's intellectual capacities found that he had, quote, significant difficulties in school with attention, concentration, and had evidence of some learning disabilities, end quote. Mr. Johnson was placed in special classes, but eventually dropped out because of his inability to function in school. Now, court psychologists actually said that, quote, Ernest had fetal alcohol effect and a low IQ, and that these were ongoing problems that don't just go away. He suffered from depression. And in regard to Mr. Johnson, it was an ongoing depression where he met the diagnostic criteria for alcohol dependence, cocaine dependence, and cannabis dependence, as well as the criteria for fetal alcohol effect. He met the criteria for long-standing depression, and he was functioning at borderline intellectual disability range. So each of those different disorders had symptoms according to the courts, but it also created problems with substance and drug dependency, mood swings, angry outbursts, and behavioral disorders. Now, it's important to understand that this is not very far off from the clinical evidence that's been accumulated over the decades concerning fetal alcohol syndrome and exposure. The work of Dr. Carbell, for instance, showed that young infants and fetuses that were exposed to alcohol increased impulsivity, produced many or varied behavioral disorders, and had negative mental and psychological effects across the course of one's life. Despite this, the overwhelming clinical and sociological evidence and expert testimony, Missouri would not give him an exemption for mental disability. Now, I say this because the way that Black men, and specifically disabled Black men, have been fighting this battle since the dawn of the 21st century is of some intellectual and theoretical note. Not simply because it violates what we take to be the established rules of jurisprudence in the Eighth Amendment, but because it also suggests to us that there's a relationship about Black males that remains consistently affirming of the need to use violence and to kill them as a means to maintain societal order. What I'd like to focus on is specifically the relationship between low IQ and Black male violence. The relationship between low intelligence quotient and Black male violence and deviance is well established throughout American academia and US culture more broadly. Philosophers and legal theorists presume that the legal subject is capable of rational explanation and engagement. Think about Pierre Schlag's work here, The Problem of the Subject in the early 1990s. But the Black man has no ethos. He's unable to be captured by the tools of legal reasoning, incapable of generating sympathy or pathos, and demonized by logos. The intellectually disabled Black man is already determined to be the expression of the Black male's deviance, not despite, but because of his lower intellectual ability and moral capacities. This ability is thought to diminish what is assumed to be the naturally occurring capacity for reason in human beings. I'm using normal here in scare quotes, or natural in scare quotes. Black men have historically been denied the fortuity of humanity for the better part of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Legal and moral philosophers have consistently failed to consider how the constitution of Black males as social beings fundamentally differ from the humanist supposition and the intersexual categories thought to dictate processes of recognition. Black males are not only thought to be less intelligent than their white American counterparts, but also less intelligent than their female counterparts. And throughout the criminological literature, the lower intelligence of Black men has been used to explain higher and disproportionate rates of violence compared to Black women. But this intellectual deficit is often associated with Black men and boys. This intellectual deficit that is often associated with Black men and boys numbs ethicists and jurors alike to the vulnerabilities Black men experience with physical and mental disability. So this article argues that the humanity of disabled Black men cannot be reclaimed within a white supremacist society that defines Black men as caricatures, justifying their lethal engagement in extermination. This is a central part of Black male studies, or a central claim of Black male studies, the notion that racism is a misandric aggression, but you can also find this in social dominance theory account of the subordinate male target hypothesis. The evidence from social psychologists, historians, and theorists overwhelmingly demonstrate that the Black male is thought to be demonic and a characterologically vacuous existence. The Black male is what non-Black males say he is, regardless of intent, act, or disability. Philosophy allies the theorization of his victimization and death because the tools of philosophical investigation almost solely depend on recognition and political consensus to activate shame, guilt, and liberal consensus around groups and individuals deemed worthy of being seen as a victim. The philosopher is enamored by abstractions of intersectional categories, which depend on the politics of the practitioner and the recognition of subjects from their peers, instead of the evidence of racial and ethnic crises that we see throughout society. The data demonstrating the deliberate executions of intellectually disabled Black men, the evidence of their death and suffering from lethal injection, suggests that we cannot trust philosophical methodology and analysis to unveil the silenced. The Black male, however, is a dehumanized object of philosophical thought. He has no subject, no somebodiness, as Martin Luther King would say, or being, no character that does not make any accusation of deviance impossible, or worse yet, an extension of his already deviant nature and lust for violence. Within this context, I argue that mental disability is not simply unrecognizable, but indistinguishable from the pathology attributed to Black men and boys in the United States. And I want to take a moment here to really clarify what I'm claiming. I do not intend to utilize a philosophical methodology to point out the neglect towards Black men in hopes of recognizing this particular form of disability or intellectual disability as a basis or claim for recognition. I think those appeals fail because overwhelmingly the evidence of Black male perception, the evidence of how Black men are seen even when innocent, the overwhelming evidence that even just hearing a Black male name triggers aggression and violence towards that group suggests that we cannot overwhelm empirical psychological disposition and behaviors towards Black men with philosophical right platitudes. What I'm hoping to do is clarify what is actually going on when we engage or encounter Black men and boys so that this could motivate public health and policy with very clear ideas and argument as to the standards needed to protect this group. So I'd like to begin by talking about mental disability and the stay of execution. This will be a very short section, but it's important to recognize that Black men have been on the forefront of these debates for the better half or the better part of the 21st century. Intellectually disabled Black men have been the litmus test of Supreme Court decisions testing the constitutionality of executing American citizens with intellectual disabilities in the 21st century. The Eighth Amendment of the United States Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment on criminal defendants. However, unlike many constitutional amendments, the Eighth Amendment has not been engaged as a static doctrine that dictates positive or negative rights of citizens. Quite to the contrary, the Eighth Amendment is thought to be dynamic and articulates the evolving standards of decency within democratic constitutional societies. This conceptualization of the Eighth Amendment was first articulated by Chief Justice Warren in 1958 when he wrote that the Eighth Amendment is not static, but, quote, must draw its meaning from evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. Despite the will of this articulated in the mid 1950s or the late 1950s, in 2002, Atkins versus Virginia was the first time that the Supreme Court clearly articulated that the execution of intellectually disabled defendants was unconstitutional. Now, Darrell Atkins was a Black man who was accused or who committed a crime of murder, but was not recognized under the statutes of intellectual disability by the state. While this was over 20 years ago, a few years ago, with the case of Mr. Bobby Moore versus Texas in 2017, challenged Texas's Lenny standard for determining whether or not defendants were actually intellectually disabled. Lenny's the character from Of Mice and Men. And despite the Atkins versus Virginia decision in 2002, Texas decided to use a outside criteria, suggesting that if an intellectually disabled person looked like, behaved like, seemed like the character Lenny from Mice and Men, this would be the basis upon which one would qualify for intellectual disability, an exemption from the death penalty. Mr. Moore was denied that. The court struck it down in 2017. But there's a Moore versus Texas 2 that happened in 2019, where the Texas state government, despite the previous ruling, failed to recognize Mr. Moore as being intellectually disabled. The Supreme Court again had to intervene to recognize Mr. Moore as disabled, which led to a conversion or commuting of the sentence from death row to life, and that allowed him to seek parole. Now, these kinds of cases aren't isolated simply to Black men, but overwhelmingly, the jurisprudence seems to fall on the question of whether or not jurors, publics, judges, and states want to execute Black men despite having clinical knowledge of intellectual disability. The current case going on right now in Tennessee with Mr. Purvis Payne is another example. So, given that this has been a consistent part of how we think jurisprudentially and ethically about this, the role the state and governments play in the execution of the intellectually disabled, one has to ask, why Black men? Why have Black males become the face of the call that the public has to not only sanction and criminalize, but to lethally execute Black males who fit within the intellectual disability exemption? I argue this is because the construction of low IQ and the Black male position in the United States has always been linked to crime. Contrary to the popular conceptualization of the Moynihan Report as a document primarily asserting that strong female households were the cause of the Black community's failure, the Moynihan Report actually maintains that the failure of Black Americans to rise as a group is the failure of Black men's inability to participate in the post civil rights economy of the United States. Moynihan is quite clear that this isolation of the Black race from equal opportunities and upward mobility of other racial and ethnic groups in the United States is due to family structure. But this is not a generalizable claim because he asserts that the middle class Black family has managed to save itself, but for vast members of the unskilled, the poorly educated, city working class, the fabric of conventional social relationships has all but disintegrated. Now, Moynihan is influenced by the work of Walter Mischel. And in that, he claims that the lower IQ of Black males makes them more prone to value immediate gratification over delayed gratification. Now, the work of Mischel is important because Mischel introduced an achievement measure in previous studies evaluating cross cultural achievement amongst non white children. His previous research found that, quote, children from other cultures as subjects prefer preference for delayed large reinforcement as opposed to immediate smaller reinforcements have been found to relate positively to social responsibility and accuracy of time statements, negatively to delinquency, positively to intelligence, and positively to the presence as opposed to the absence of the father within the home under similar conditions. Years later, Mischel would author the marshmallow test as a summarization of his decades of research, which found that children with impulse control who tended to delay gratification were not only more academically high achieving, but successful over life course. So Moynihan was clear that the Black family and the Black community was forced into matriarchal structures because American racism, quote, retarded the progress of the group as a whole and imposed a crushing burden on the Negro male and in consequence, a great many Negro women as well. So Moynihan understood that the systems of racism particularly and peculiarly targeted Black men. He wrote that keeping the Negro in his place could be translated as keeping the Negro male in his place, since no one believed the female was a threat to anyone. So this is what worked against a strong father figure, and this is what created the disincentive for Black men to pursue higher education. He argued that because the need to control and dictate the proximities of Black men to the dominant population was routinely carried out through acts of overt violence and the removal of Black men and boys from society, that this only impeded the ability of Black men to pursue and elevate within society. So Black men became a caste population, so to speak. But the implication is not just the bias of Moynihan. Rather, it's that this created an incentive for academics to link Black masculinity with social deviance as a cultural phenomenon. This aversion towards Black men and boys in the United States culminated in interdisciplinary projects aimed at explaining Black male deviance, aggression, and low intelligence by marrying cutting edge biostatistical data with gender theory. By the mid 20th century, sociologists and ethnologists dedicated themselves to linking the apatriarchality of Black males or Black men's inability to peacefully coexist within or lead a traditional nuclear family as a pathway to street culture and deviance. The presumed absenteeism of adult Black males within the Black home was linked to sexual confusion and hypermasculinity as an internalized female personality disorder amongst Black boys, gangsterism, deviant behaviors, and lower intelligence. By the 1970s, these criminological theories, which had previously presumed the crisis of the Black family as the origin of Black deviance, became almost completely dictated by subcultural racial analysis. In 1967, Wolfgang and Ferracuti published The Subculture of Violence Towards an Integrated Theory in Criminology, which argued that Black Americans had a particularly violent subculture which tended towards physical aggression and homicide. Now composed primarily of analyses of homicide rates in Philadelphia, Wolfgang and Ferracuti theorized that rates of homicide amongst racial groups that were disaggregated by sex and class could not only explain but identify varying racial, cultural, populational tendencies within the same geographic location. A few years later, in Forcible Patterns of Rape, Menachem Amir, the student of Wolfgang Ferracuti, argued that the Negro male's aggressive sexuality seems to be more problematically due to the strong need to overcome problems of masculinity and sexual identity. Now, it's important because Menachem Amir's argument was that we could understand the subcultural analysis introduced by Wolfgang and Ferracuti as particular to Negro Black male masculinity, such that it always expressed violence and deficiency. He goes so far as to argue that the Negro subculture is in his unique is a his an historically unique subculture, which embodies all the characteristics of a lower class subculture, but has some of its features in a more pronounced form. The Negro subculture is characterized by the revolving of life around some basic focal concerns, which includes a search for thrills through aggressive acts and sexual exploits. Now, while the subculture violence theory wasn't explicitly linked to IQ, and we usually associate intelligence quotients and deviance to the publication of the bell curve, specifically chapters 11 and 12, throughout the 1970s, intelligence was thought to be a proxy for social integration, class elevation, and deviance. Black men were thought to be the least integrated, the least capable of sustained employment or educational attainment, and the most criminal group in the United States. Consequently, they were also thought to be the least intelligent. Psychologists like Arthur R. Jensen in 1971 suggested that Black males were problems for society because of their lower intelligence drove them towards deviance and underperformance. This was picked up in the mid 1970s by people like Lynn A. Curtis, who suggested that Jensen's argument was true, but it could be specied more. It could be more intersectional, so to speak, because the deviance of Black males was unique to that race and sex trait and not a shared racial trait that could be applied to Black females. Because Jensen found that Black females had a higher IQ quotient compared to the Black male counterparts, they were less likely to engage in social deviance. This was continued and picked up by Travis Hershey and Michael Hindegland in 1977, where they shared the concern of contemporary social sciences, but believed that IQ was a definitive variable in dictating the perpetration and propensity to create acts of violence. Now, the masculinity idea or category became a central concern because in the mid 1970s, people like Susan Brown Miller was citing Lene Curtis and Menachem Amir and Wolfgang and Ferracuti and took the idea that machismo or lower class Black masculinity sought to fulfill its aim towards violence by performing masculinity. So, whereas masculinity may be an idea for the American culture or the white culture or mainstream American culture, there was this degrading that happened when you put it into lower, poor, Black, and disenfranchised classes. So, this analysis of poor Black males being more dangerous than white men or more likely to express pathologized versions of American masculinity became central to how Black males were theorized, not only within gender theory, but also affected the potential they were thought to have as rehabilitated within the criminal justice system. So the adoption of a racial sexual stratification theory within liberal arts disciplines led to the assumption that patriarchal violence, which was now understood to be an essential aspect of male identity, was a universal but socialized component of Black masculinity. Black men were compensatory beings who used murder, aggression, and sexual violence to perform masculinity. And similarly, authors like Bell Hooks, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Frank Rudy Cooper would take this to also be able to be explained within an intersectional analysis. I'll end by saying that this provides not only a problem, but a theoretical caution to how we understand or try to diagnose the inequalities associated with disabled Black males. The disabled Black male finds himself defined negatively by the lack of human qualities attributed to him. And this is important because I'm suggesting that the work that we're doing in looking at disability or looking at Black men and boys and the problems of discrimination and, in most cases, lethal violence, do not appreciate the levels of dehumanization attributed specifically to that group. The philosophical anthropology of the Black male has never presumed rationality or intelligence as belonging to his particular genre. The normal Black male, again in scare quotes, is intellectually deficient and amoral. Throughout the last 2 or 3 centuries, he has been constructed as a savage being that must be controlled through legal repression and extra legal terror. Consequently, again, the normal Black male has no attributes thought to be diminished by intellectual disability because the disabled Black male is merely one particular and expected expression of Black men and boys in the United States. So, this casting of Black men as disabled does not create another form of marginalization, but in fact is one particular expression of what is presumed to be the natural aversions that Black men have for civility and their tendency towards violence. The implication of this argument is that it suggests to us that disability, again, cannot simply be articulated as an additional marginalization, that the ways that we approach both social stigma, disadvantage, and societal ostracization must consider the ways that the particular population and group has been constructed. Philosophical analyses that merely reach towards recognition of a group without considering the sociogenic or the ways that society has particularly constructed and the function that these characters or constructions of these groups have in society are continually going to fail. Even though we have Atkins, Virginia on the books, Black men with intellectual disabilities like Mr. Johnson continually have to fight to be recognized as disabled and not fulfilling some criminal genetic end that they're thought to have. So I'll end with that, and I hope that through the Q&A, we could discuss more what could be better alternatives than merely reaching forward for some kind of acceptance of the disabled Black male.
Thank you, Tommy. So I think Jonathan's going to ask the first question.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'll do it on camera if I may. So really fascinating, Tommy. I mean, so much there. And at one point early on, you came back to this at the end, that I think you say we have to get beyond philosophical platitudes, which of course I agree, although getting as far as philosophical platitudes in some cases would be an improvement on where we are at the moment. But you move from that to, you mentioned, I think at that time, public health and criminal justice.
Yeah. Yes.
And it is clear that criminal justice is the really sharp end here, and some of the atrocious decisions that you documented really are appalling. But I wondered whether you were picking on criminal justice system just because that is a sharp end where the most atrocious things are happening, or whether you think that by reforming criminal justice system, we'll be able to do things more broadly throughout society, because after all, it is the tip of the iceberg. The discrimination takes place so many other areas in life, and can we lead change through the criminal justice system, or do we need to have many other types of interventions as well? So
no, thank you so much. Let me say, for the purpose of this paper, I focus on the criminal justice system because I'm dealing with, of course, the death penalty and the exemptions under the Eighth Amendment. I don't think that we can lead through criminal justice, largely because I think there are antecedents to it, which is why I think public health is so important. What we have is a criminalization of Black male disability, where intellectual disabilities or any other affective disorders, be it depression or interpersonal conflicts, etc., are always read as fulfilling some kind of pathological or savage nature of the Black male. And I think what ends up happening with this is that we don't have access and resources, proper training at the clinical and the primary care level that allows us to basically to curb some of these societal tendencies and stereotypes. I mean, the reality of the situation is that when we're looking at any form of social deviance, poverty, neglect, exposure to violence are dictates of violent behavior. That goes across groups. But when it comes to Black men, we somehow eliminate the sociological and appeal to the ontological. The criminal justice system is important here because the end of Black men's lives seems to largely be at the hand of the state. So even with the case of Purvis in Tennessee right now, the question is, will they even consider that he's intellectually disabled as a basis of contextualizing the crime that he's accused for? So the criminal justice system, given this huge bias that most of the people on death row are Black men and many have intellectual disabilities, that becomes a huge in itself, so to speak, because we're trying to stop the finality of the consequences, which is the illegal execution, or I should say, rather, the unconstitutional execution of mentally disabled Black men. I think the quickest thing, of course, for that, if I'm going to take a normative approach, is to say abolish the death penalty, right? Because that's the problem. But at the same time, when you look at the rates of mass incarceration, police engagement, even the negative traumatic effects that Black men have with, stop and frisk and racial profiling, and some of these are sexual, some of these are made to penetrate incidences of violence where police officers are raping and sexually assaulting Black men on top of executing them in lethally or through all. I mean, it's just so much chokeholds, shooting them, etc. Right. This is more than just the finality of the death penalty or the criminal justice system. This is the societal apparatus that breeds misandry and fear and aversion to Black male existence. And what I'm worried about in philosophy is that there's such an overdetermination about which groups should be recognized or should be discussed, that when you look at the overwhelming evidence of Black male vulnerability, not only in the case of intellectual disability, but you could talk about domestic violence, you could talk about rape and made to penetrate violence, you could talk about low life expectancy. This group simply falls through the cracks because we despise Black men in this country. Or, well, I guess we're talking in multiple countries, but at least in the United States definitively, right? And I take that to be a major philosophical problem because no one wants to seem to study or advocate for the most dehumanized populations amongst us.
Can I follow up on
Please.
this, if I may? And I've got a nagging feeling I may have asked you this exactly the same question a year ago, but so you mentioned social dominance theory.
Yes.
And when I read it, one of the things that was most striking was exactly the point you're making now, that in American society, Black men are treated as a threat in a way in which Black women typically are not.
Mm-hmm.
And Black women find it easier to find a place in the workplace and so on. And when I read that, it struck true for me in what little I know about American society, but it also ran up against some of the sort of received wisdom about intersectionality.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you just have a comment on that.
I mean, intersectionality is wrong, at least when we practice it theoretically. And, I've been fighting for years just to say, why don't we look at evidence? Like, I'm not opposed to, Black women have tons of different vulnerabilities, right? We know maternal death, we know, diminished returns, compared to their white counterpart. But the issue is that they're interactive effects between variables that we find in data sets. We can't just intuit certain disadvantages. But when you compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, so if I'm looking at Black people and I'm using gender as the independent variable to figure out what are the certain outcomes that happen, you're not going to get what intersectional theory says. You're just not going to get this huge disparity of Black women compared to Black men in many of the categories that we look at to talk about the health of a demography. So life expectancy, education, social mobility, exposure to violence, mass incarceration, even reproductive control, you're going to find that Black men experience those things usually worse or equal to their female counterpart. And that's not to say that Black women don't have disadvantages, but it is to say that the way that we start describing gender and articulating the gender category does not have an absolute causal effect. Our femininity, more accurately, doesn't have an absolute causal effect to certain kind of violences, as liberal arts theorists want to concede. And I think that it's because of that falsifiability of the intuitive claims of intersectionality that many philosophers simply refuse to engage concrete empirical or epidemiological evidence. So this suggests to us that while it does run counter to the intuitions of intersectionality, as philosophers, we're not here to, to affirm or confirm to the masses. We're here to do research that introduce theories that create better explanatory frameworks of disadvantage. And given that, I think people like social dominance theorists or groups like social dominance theorists, I think the work of Black male studies scholars, and I mean, I just think most social scientists generally are adding more nuance that philosophers simply refuse at this point.
Thank you. Okay, I have a question from Elena Gautier Mamaril. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. Do you have examples of ways in which philosophers can reach out to policymakers in an effective way? And I'll just remind everyone to speak slower than usual for the closed captioning.
Yeah, if that was me, I'm sorry. It becomes very, very difficult. A lot of the work that I've started to do over the last 2 years has been explicitly with organizations that are looking at victims, be they victims of sexual violence or disabled Black men involved with criminal justice. I think philosophers have to not, I don't want to say do advocacy work because I think that we create divides between activists and scholars, but I think that we have to develop arguments and a base of scholarship that's willing to reach into the real world and make commentaries with social policy and affect opinion and policymakers. I mean, so much of the work that we do around race and gender in philosophy is having debates with the same 30 or 40 people for all of our careers. And then when those people disagree with something you say, you're on the outs with those group of people as philosophers. You have to look for other fields as opposed to say, look, let's just stand on the evidence and data and let's argue about the implications of it. So I think philosophers have to become much more versatile and engage with social science and policy. And one of the reasons that I pursued a master's of public health is because I'm fundamentally interested in how intraracial violence both occurs, how it spreads, and how policy tries to engage or intervene in Black and other racial and ethnic minority communities. So data becomes important to that. It doesn't become determinative, but it becomes important. So philosophers, in order to engage this problem and to spread kind of our opinions, has to be able to speak in the language of policymakers and public health officials who actually dictate how resources go into certain communities and how certain forms of interventions, be they legal or social, get translated into legislation. And our inability to deal with concrete matters and translate things to how it matters to policymakers and legislatures limits why philosophical argumentation and scholarship can or does affect the real world.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is from Andrea Pitts. Many thanks for this important work, Dr. Curry. I very much appreciate your deep dive into Eighth Amendment jurisprudence, as this case history is so vital in understanding and critiquing anti-Black carceral practices today. My question is about how Black trans women, including Black trans women who are incarcerated in men's prisons and who themselves have challenged and shaped contemporary Eighth Amendment case law, as D. Farmer in Farmer versus Brennan 1994, might play a role in your critique of the lack of vulnerability of Black males, and perhaps how compulsory cis heteronormativity and the pathologization of gender variance may also play a role in your analysis. Many thanks, as always, for your work.
Thank you so much for the question. Well, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, one of the ways that I've dealt with this is in terms of how, I don't want to say gender norms, but how concepts of formidability surrounding the body, the Black male body, is utilized as the basis of incarceration and treatment within the prison system. So I think that if you have trans women and their gender or their sexuality is not being recognized, how they perceive the body, and they're being placed because of how the criminal justice system determines them biologically as Black males, then that's going to be part of the same kind of spectrum that leads to the overdetermination and pathologization of Black men generally. In my work, I don't give much weight to the idea of cisness and heteronormativity, because what I'm trying to show is that the Black male category is vacuous. And what I mean by that is that throughout the last 200 years, Black maleness is the category of negativity that can be called or defined as animal or pedophile or queer. You pick the pathology of the decade, and that's what Black maleness stands for within the sociological literature. So I think that this is the kind of fungibility and the position, especially within the prison industrial complex. In my book, The Man Not, I talk about this in chapter 2, where Eldridge Cleaver talks about the kind of malleability of Black male flesh within the walls of the prison, where the Black male becomes whatever the guards or other inmates want that flesh to be. If it's feminine, if it's queer, if it's, whatever use you have for Black male flesh, that's what it is. That kind of functional analysis, I think, operates the same way on trans women, because it's the fungibility of the biological form that's imposed upon by the will of the prison industrial complex that produces product, labor, or even extreme forms of violence. So I think, again, it's important to the project, but these are all different genres of experience and genres of being that have to be considered if we're going to do a more expansive analysis of gender overall.
Thank you. Okay, so I have a question from Maeve O'Donovan. Thank you for your important and excellent paper. I particularly appreciate your use of philosophy alongside your explanation of why this isn't a matter of philosophical reform. I take this to be the kind of public philosophy the APA has been supporting of late. I'm aware of your mistreatment in the USA. Have you and your work been better received where you are? And if so, what might be the differences that explain that? For example, differences in the legal system, differences in the response to colonialism and slavery, or is that way too optimistic?
I think anything's more optimistic than the United States. Here I think my work is appreciated. People certainly have disagreements, but nobody's threatened to kill me because of them. But I think that part of it as well is that while there's certainly institutional and structural racism in the UK, it doesn't have the same kind of violence associated with it, and is not as misandric as in the United States. In the United States, amongst white philosophers and Black philosophers, there's a debate as to whether or not Black men are violent and pathological. So even the publications that come out in philosophy that are readily available in journals still cite people like Bell Hooks, who specifically and deliberately articulate subculture of violence theory as the basis of reading Black men. And whereas here I can say, hey, look at this horrible history of IQ tests and disproportionate rates of violence, all leading to racist caricatures. In the United States, you can't write papers about Bell Hooks because they say that they will not publish them. You just can't question Black feminism or intersectionality. In the UK, it's an argument. I can give tons of evidence, I can give tons of quotations, I can trace the intellectual genealogy, and I can engage the problem scholarly. So I think that the UK is more open to just like good work, right? It's not ideologically committed to things in the same way. As to whether or not overall is better, who knows, right? I've only been here for a few years, but I think the problem that we have in the United States compared to the UK is that while we talk about race and anti-Blackness all day, very few of us actually have to prove it. And I think there are pluses and minuses to that. On the one hand, in the United States, white liberals are ready to accept any analysis of anti-Blackness as being, kind of a constituent part of being a good liberal, recognizing social inequality. But when it comes down to the specifics of that racism, like knowing social dominance theory or having familiarity with 19th century ethnology, nobody cares, because as a philosopher in America, you could wake up one day, say I study race after I study, pragmatism or Heidegger, et cetera, and everybody embraces you because it fits the liberal consensus. Here, you still have to make a case for it. And I think that that's both good and bad. It's good in the sense that the work has to be rigorous and has to be recognized as rigorous. And it's bad in the sense that, they're 20 or 30 years behind the United States and constantly deny something that's part of their own colonial heritage and social system. But intellectually, it's more freeing because I get to have conversations that by any measure, especially given my publication rate and acceptance rate, would be considered good scholarship and top research. So yeah, I think America has a problem with Black men. I think that philosophy hides behind its liberal politics, which makes it extremely difficult for most senior Black men to challenge it. And I think the UK certainly has its racism and problems, but it's less violent and seemingly, I mean, I could change this in a year depending, right? Seems to be more open to the debates.
Okay, so I'm being told we're out of time,
Okay.
but so unfortunately, I don't have time for another question. Yeah, but thank you so much. That generated a really good discussion, lots of questions, and yeah, thank you so much for presenting your work to us. And I'll just mention, yes, so Tommy has published a lot, and I would encourage everyone to check out his massive body of work. It's very interesting, including his work on Black males and disability. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there. So yeah, thank you so much for presenting to us.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Well, Mitch, thank you for sharing so well, and Tommy for such an interesting presentation and discussion.